Bé, bon dia. Comencem aquest acte d'inauguració de curs del Servei de Llengües, que ja hem convertit en una tradició des dels últims anys. En primer lloc, intervindrà breument la vicegerenta d'Ordenació Acadèmica, la Montserrat Masoliver, que és la responsable del Servei de Llengües, que ens adreçarà unes paraules breus de benvinguda. Quan vulguis, Montse.
Bon dia a tothom, benvinguts a la sala de juntes i a l'Autònoma. No m'havien dit que havia de parlar, llavors serà tot molt improvisat. Estic veient professors que havia tingut jo a la meva època d'estudiant al Servei de Llengües i em fa il·lusió, em fa molta il·lusió obrir aquest acte del nou curs acadèmic 14-15. Pel que sé del que em va explicar la Marta, la matrícula als cursos va prou bé. Tenim, sobretot amb l'anglès, bastants estudiants i hem pogut omplir els cursos. Per tant, també ens hem de felicitar una mica perquè seguim tenint els cursos plens. I jo només volia desitjar que aquest curs acadèmic estigui ple d'èxits, ple d'oportunitats, també ple d'algunes sorpreses, perquè suposo que més endavant, amb tots els acords entre les universitats d'acreditar el B2 de terceres llengües, potser tindrem novetats i potser tindrem una mica més de feina, però això ja ho anirem veient en el futur. I res més, i passar ja la paraula al doctor Lluís Quintana, que farà realment ell l'obertura.
Hem decidit que tanques tu i que passa directament la...
Doncs passo la paraula a la conferenciant, a l'Emilee S.
Un moment, la presentes tu?
Sí. Bé, doncs tenim avui entre nosaltres la doctora Emilee S, que ens farà una conferència que porta per títol Language Learning in the Wild in Higher Education. L'Emilee S és professora de cursos de grau i de postgrau aquí a l'Autònoma, al Departament de Didàctica de la Llengua, la Literatura i les Ciències Socials, i alhora també és la directora del Servei de Llengües de la Universitat Internacional de Catalunya, on també és professora de l'assignatura d'anglès amb finalitats específiques. L'Emilee S és també membre del GREIP, el grup de recerca en educació i interacció plurilingües, basat aquí a l'Autònoma, i ha fet recerca en àmbits com ICLA o CLIL, en plurilingüisme, multilingüisme, en ensenyament superior. De fet, ella va fer la seva tesi aquí a l'Autònoma l'any 2011 sobre la interacció plurilingüe en una universitat catalana i bé, crec que la conferència d'avui ens explicarà una mica els resultats d'aquesta recerca. Doncs quan vulguis, Emilee.
Això funciona així? Sí. Doncs, vicerector, gerenta, directora del Servei de Llengües. En primer lloc, vull donar les gràcies. Obro, no? Vull donar les gràcies per aquesta invitació. La veritat és que m'impressiona molt aquest context i estar entre gent que respecto molt i un servei de llengües que respecto molt. Per tant, gràcies i espero fer-ho bé. He preparat la presentació en anglès perquè així em sento més còmoda, però tinc les diapositives en català. Doncs, so I'm going to be structuring my presentation basically in two parts. In the first part of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the results of a project that I participated in from 2006 to 2011, known as DILAN. Basically, in order to provide context for what I'm going to be presenting in the second part of the presentation, which is a smaller study that was part of this bigger project that I think has potential to continue and that I think could be relevant to a language service. So, to get started, we're going to look at DILAN. So the DILAN project, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it at all. I know that we did collaborate with the Servei de Llengües quite a bit on this project. DILAN stood for Language Dynamics and Management of Diversity. It was a 6-framework European project that involved the participation of 18 teams from across Europe. It ran from 2006 to 2011, and the basic objective of the project was to show conditions in which linguistic diversity in Europe could be considered an advantage for knowledge construction and also for the economy. So with a background in education, obviously the team that I was part of was more interested in how linguistic diversity could be considered an advantage in terms of knowledge construction than in terms of the economy. So the team that I worked with, my research team, el grup de recerca en ensenyament i interaccions plurilingües, based in the Department of Language Teaching Methodologies here at the UAB, basically carried out our research in the field of higher education. We carried out research at two public Catalan universities. The other teams working on the project also looked at companies, European companies, and also European institutions. Yeah. The analytical framework of the project was this. This is the nice map that we had. So we were asked to look at policies and strategies, contextual issues as well, so the socio-historical contexts in which we were working, the representation, so what people were saying about language diversity, and also what was happening in linguistic practices, in plurilingual practices in the field. The background of my own team is more in the study of practices, plurilingual practices, and so this is where we really did most of our research, and from there we looked at what was happening, what people were saying, what was happening in policies, and how that could all be related to the socio-historical context. Yeah? But I insist that our expertise would be in the study of practices more than in the other fields. So basically, as part of Dylan, we collected a multimodal corpus, a polycentric corpus of practices across different settings in Catalan public universities, two public Catalan universities. Basically, the sites that we studied were classes taught in English, so academic subjects, you know, in different faculties across the universities, such as educational psychology, computer engineering, where English was starting to be introduced, either as a way of including international students in the classroom or as a way of internationalizing at home. Yeah, working with local students and getting them prepared for their international careers. We also looked at service encounters taking place across the universities. We looked at informal interactions between students, yeah, between local and international students, where the students would carry microphones around for a couple of days and record the different interactions that they had. And we looked at interactions taking place in informal ceremonies. Yeah, so in the latter three situations, we were always looking at interactions that involved both local and international actors. So the questions that we asked as part of Dylan, as part of the UAB team's work on Dylan, were many. We had 5 years to ask questions, to reject questions, and to ask new questions. Yeah, but looking back, we probably asked things like this: how is multilingualism understood across diverse practices? When, how, why, and for what are plurilingual resources mobilized across diverse practices? How is the mobilization of plurilingual resources related to the accomplishment of different interactional, social, and institutional goals? And within the institutional goals, we included goals of internationalization. Yeah, so how could language uses be linked to internationalization strategies? How is the mobilization of plurilingual resources related to knowledge construction? Yeah, so we were interested in seeing in classrooms, for example, when people were using more than one language to carry out their activities, why were they doing that? What was doing things in more than one language giving them that doing things in just one language wouldn't? And we also looked at the relationship between policies and practices, but again, I insist that we didn't carry out an extensive analysis of the policies. Yeah. And so then, giving a very brief response to some of those questions, we saw a clear link between use of Catalan and institutional practices, and I point this out because we even saw this in international settings. Yeah, so often we represent Catalan as a local language, and in our data we see Catalan being used even in international situations, which makes us call into question some of the ideologies about this language as being local or international. Yeah, this was something that was surprising in terms of other the data being brought in by other universities, other teams on the project, and I guess shows the strength of the policies that have been put in place here. Quite obviously, we also saw that the international trade was related to other languages, especially English and Spanish, and with new forms of plurilingualism, new plurilingual practices. We found that using more than one language within the same interaction was quite normal, and that this was even the case in formal situations, although it was less common in this sense. And we argued that such plurilingual uses favoured participation, social relationships, and most importantly, the simultaneous management of local and international agendas. Yeah, so by switching, people were able to handle different agendas at once. So this leads us to say that using language is more complex than just communicating. Yeah, people also use language to accomplish social actions that go beyond just communicating. Yeah, this is not new to our study. We also saw that internationalization turned everyday situations into intercultural and plurilingual situations, which were in turn extremely rich environments for teaching and learning language. And this is what I'll be focusing on today. And finally, we argued that it's very difficult for university language policies to represent all of this complexity, and that's normal. So the general results of Dylan, not just ours, but from the other teams as well, were published in 2011, and they're available on the website if anybody's interested. Yeah, in particular, the Dylan booklet summarizes the findings from the project if you'd like to download it and to see what we said. Yeah, and then in the case of the UAV, our results have also been published in different formats. I don't really like projecting this, but I mean, we have more comprehensive answers to the questions that we asked in the literature that we've published. Yeah. Then in collaboration with the Servei de Llengües here at the UAB in 2011, I think, we also put out a website, Actiu Plurilingüe, which you're probably all quite familiar with. And the idea here was to bring some of the results from the research to the teachers, that are starting to teach in English, maybe, to researchers, and to try and encourage them to incorporate more than just one language in the activities that they carry out in the classroom and in their research. And then finally, because it seems to be the fashion in research, we've made a postcard. And in this postcard, we summarized our findings for the university community and beyond. Yeah, I don't know if you ever saw a copy of these postcards, but they were there. Yeah, and I'm just going to read, if you guys will excuse my French, I'm going to read the recommendations that we made, which were really the result of research, even though they can seem quite trivial. Yes, my French here. On verse dans le pot toute la capitale linguistique de nos universités, toutes les langues sont valables pour fer de la science. Yeah. Incorporem més una llengua en les diferents activitats acadèmiques que proposem. Això significa tenir més recursos amb els quals participar i construir coneixements. Blending international academic settings in all of our languages and take an interest in the languages of the communities that welcome us. Using different languages makes us more sociable. Exprimimos todas las oportunidades que se nos presentan en la vida diaria de las universidades dentro y fuera de las aulas para aprender y ensenyar lenguas. I servim els resultats de la nostra recerca no només en llengües internacionals, sinó també en llengües locals. Així ajudem a renovar les llengües i fer circular els coneixements. Yeah? I'm showing you that because it's related to what I want to talk to you today. I don't know if you noticed that was a recipe, by the way. It was the metaphor was meant to be the recipe for making crema catalana, and on the other side it said that crema catalana was very easy to make and you could make it for any occasion. Yeah, whether you had people over or not. Yeah, so we can do all of this whether we have international guests or not. Yeah, so point number 4, step number 4 in the recipe is related to what I want to talk about today. Yeah. About language learning in the wild in higher education. So I'm going to be looking at this concrete study now. So the context is one that would be familiar to you all. It's a university in Catalonia undergoing internationalization, where improving the plurilingual competencies of university staff and students is a strategic issue, it's a policy concern, and where language learning is being promoted, although this may normally be in formal settings such as classrooms. So basically, I'm going to be taking a look at part of the corpus that I presented before, but only the data that we collected outside of classroom settings. So we know that learning takes place in classrooms. We hope that learning takes place in classrooms. And what we noticed when we looked across the corpus is that language learning might also be taking place in settings that were not a priori about language learning. And this grabbed our attention. So reminding you of the corpus, I'm going to be presenting some data from the service encounters that take place at a reception service for international students. So it's where the students go to get information about the university on their arrival, register, get their student card, etc. Also, informal interactions on campus between a local student and a student from the United States, and an award ceremony and an honoris causa, doctor award ceremony involving an international scholar. So in the title of my presentation, I talk about language learning in the wild, and to tell you the truth, I've had a hard time translating it into Catalan. So it's trying to capture this idea of informal learning that takes place in contexts that are not contemplated for learning. I've put here informal. Initially I had natural, but that's not really what I want to capture, and it's not salvaje either. No, but the idea is this learning that takes place in settings that are not contemplated previously for learning. In using this term, I'm drawing on Edwin Hutchins, who wrote about cognition in the wild back in 1995, and here you have his book. And Hutchins is interesting. He's a cognitive scientist who used anthropological methods for studying cognition, for studying how people think. So rather than looking at what people do in laboratories, he looked at what people do in the wild. And this was quite new at the time in cognitive sciences. It's also interesting to note that he's a navigator, an avid navigator on ships. So the study that motivated his book on cognition in the wild took place on the navigation deck of a Navy ship. He carried out an ethnographic study, an anthropological study, looking at how cognition could be understood as being socially distributed across the crew members, and including the maps, including the entire ecology of the navigation deck, rather than being inside any particular mind. So thinking was not inside any particular mind, but was shared, socially distributed across the navigation deck, including all of the resources in the environment. And he came to define the notion of cognition in the wild, as you've got here. Cognition in the wild refers to human cognition in its natural habitat, and that is to naturally occurring, culturally constituted human activity. I have in mind the distinction between the laboratory, where cognition is studied in captivity, and the everyday world, where human cognition adapts to its natural surroundings. I hope to evoke with this metaphor a sense of an ecology of thinking in which human cognition interacts with an environment rich in organizing resources. So this is input from cognitive sciences, cognitive anthropology, I think we could call it. But also in studies of language and of interaction, we take a similar approach to cognition. So we see cognition as something that we can see. When we talk about cognitive activity, we're always talking about what happens in interaction between people rather than talking about what they might have in their heads. And in doing so, we're bringing in an entire ecology. So everything that's around them is part of cognitive activity. So in my particular influences come from a field that we would call CA, Conversation Analysis for Second Language Acquisition, which basically draws on conversation analysis, which is an approach to studying the grammar of interaction, we could say, that emerged from sociology, and sociocultural theories of learning. So the marriage of these two approaches would be what we call conversation analysis for second language acquisition, which is a non-mainstream approach to studying language learning, we could say. So in CA for SLA research usually takes a kind of learning as a situated activity, or of what Firth and Wagner referred to as doing learning. Yeah, so we're looking at what we see people doing rather than making assumptions about what we think people are thinking. Yeah, and basically when people do learning, they're engaging in more than just accomplishing understanding and being understood. Yeah, so this is the case in data from ordinary non-classroom interaction studied in the research here. Yeah. In such research, people momentarily attend to aspects of a second language while engaging in other interactional, social, institutional work. And they demonstrate a disposition to teach and learn, and to assign and accept roles such as teacher, learner, expert, non-expert. The notion of didactic contract is one way of conceptualizing how such context for learning can be accomplished as an outcome of ordinary activity. It helps us to conceptualize a momentary contract that emerges between people that are talking together, whereby somebody can correct, somebody is willing to receive a correction, for example. Yeah, and the Swiss applied linguists talk about potential acquisition sequences, and this is relevant. Yeah, so we're always talking about what could potentially be happening in the long term in people's brains. Yeah, based on what we're seeing. Yeah, so we're talking about looking at what people do and then making guesses about what could potentially happen in the long run, rather than taking a firm stance that learning is happening here. Yeah. So, in carrying out the analysis of the corpus, we're interested in understanding what interactional conditions in situations that were not supposed to be about learning, a priori, led people to stop what they were doing and momentarily pay attention to language. And I'm going to present a conversation analysis for you, but then I'm going to go into something a little bit more applied. Yeah, so I'm going to be basically the way that I've organized this analysis is in what we call collections. So we look for collections of interactions that look about the same. Yeah, and we study them as entities. Yeah, and try to generalize from that. So the sequences that we found are basically sequences that involve repair, involve problems, and other sequences that don't. Yeah. So we're going to start walking through the corpus. So the first interaction that I'm going to present is an example of a sequence where there's a problem that needs to be fixed. Yeah, the problem is a word search. There's an unknown word. So the interaction takes place between two students, a local student, Roger, and then a student from the United States, Simon. And the two students are walking along, and they're comparing the way Christmas is celebrated in Catalonia and in the United States. And Simon wants to tell Roger that in the United States, the 25th is more important than Reis. Yeah? And he also wants to tell him that the Mass on the 24th is more important, no? But he doesn't have the term to talk about the Mass, la misa legal. Yeah? And so Roger basically teaches him this term, and Roger helps him with the term, and we can assume that Simon may have learned something from that.
És més important de Noé als Estats Units, el dia de Nadal.
Sí, el dia de Nadal que no passa ningú.
O anar a la missa?
La missa del gall.
A les 12 de la nit.
Exacte, la missa del gall.
Sí. Com es diu?
La missa del gall.
Del gall?
El gall. Chicken.
Del com?
Chicken.
Chicken? Com gai d'indi?
Sí, però...
Aquí. Gai, com gallina. Oh.
Yeah. So we can argue about whether what he learned was correct or not. The point is that there was an orientation here to learning, to teaching and learning, which could be good for Simon's learning of Catalan in this case. I'm going to show you another short example of this, a word search. I'm only going to show you this example because it takes place during a really formal ceremony. the situation is this. The Professor Martin, who is a scholar from the United States, has just received an honorary doctorate from the university. And she's going to deliver her lecture. She's delivering her lecture, yeah? And her lecture is on the theme of evolution. And at one point in her presentation, she projects some slides where there's an octopus swimming in and out. And she wants to comment on the octopus, but she doesn't have the word for that in Spanish, yeah? So somebody from the audience can tell that she's having a problem and produces the word pulpo. She incorporates it into her speech and keeps on going. It's strange because it's a very formal setting. Yeah.
Este animal, ¿has visto el pulpa? Gracias, pulpa.
Yeah. Again, whether she got it or not, the point is that she's orienting to learning. She's putting herself in the position of learner and orienting to learning, and this could be good for her acquisition. Yeah. The second type of repair sequence that I wanted to show from the corpus is what we call non-understandings. So this would be when somebody produces a word in a conversation and their interlocutor doesn't understand, yeah, what's being said and needs assistance to understand. So this interaction takes place at the reception service of international students. Basically, Lydia is the worker and she's interacting with Uriana and Costas, two Greek students, and they're talking about the price of renting flats in Barcelona. Yeah, so Costas points to a map. I can't show the video to protect identities. Yeah, Costas points to the map and says it's very expensive in a certain area, and Lydia says, yeah, it's expensive there, and in Gracia too, it's a nightmare. Costas doesn't understand the word nightmare and gets help from Uriana, his companion, who speaks a little bit more English than him. After she explains to him the meaning, he integrates nightmare, he repeats it.
I mean, it's expensive living in Barcelona.
In here we found 1,300, 1,000.
Because this is a nightmare, and Gracia too.
Tina?
I don't know if you heard right at the end there how he integrates these nightmares. So a final type of repair sequence that sometimes develops into potential acquisition in the corpus is correction. Yeah. So I'm going to show you a very short fragment again. We'll listen to a short fragment again from the interaction between Roger and Simon. They're part of the choir. They've just left their choir rehearsal. And Simon, who comes from Princeton, is explaining that when he was in the choir at Princeton, they would go on tours all over the place, to Germany, to Spain, and to Svizzera. Yeah. Roger corrects him with Suiza, and they go on with the rest of their talk.
I fèiem tours d'una setmana fora de Princeton, com aquí, en Alemanya, en Svizzera, Suïssa, altres llocs.
So sometimes the corrections are less obvious. I want to show you this example because it's funny, huh? Sometimes the corrections are less obvious, what we call embedded corrections. Yeah. So this, the final fragment that I'll show you of examples of repair emerges at the reception service for international students again. Lydia is serving a student from Poland, Katarina, and she's telling her that here in Catalonia there's a show, Polonia, and she starts to explain to her that in the people from other parts of Spain refer to Catalans as polacos. Yeah. Next to Lydia we have Hayat, who's a worker, also at the reception service, who's originally from Iraq, and so for her this information is also a little bit new, and she explains that she's heard something else, that she's been told something else. She's been told that it's an insult rather than being, something more innocent. The thing is that she says insulta. A mí me han dit que es para insulta. Yeah? And Lydia doesn't understand what she's saying. Un qué? See? Insulta. So eventually they work out what they're trying to say. Lydia corrects her. Hayat quietly repeats the correction, so she takes it on board and the interaction continues.
Per insultar una persona que ha passat a mi.
¿Cuánto tiempo tenemos?
Insultar, per insultar. No, sí, però és el que et dic, perquè els catalans, a Espanya se li deia polaco.
Yeah. So until now we've been seeing how people take opportunities to teach and learn languages in places where teaching and learning languages is not the main business, when there's been a problem. Yeah, and that doesn't seem too surprising. What surprised us a little bit more is that people also orient to language teaching and learning when there's no apparent problem in communicating. Yeah, so again, from the reception service, we have Lydia and Katarina again, who we just met. And as Lydia is filling out the computer registration form, she asks Katarina, how do you say your country in your language? And Katarina teaches her Polska. Yeah, it's a very short fragment.
How do you pronounce your country? ¿Eres con ella o no? Polska. No puedes.
Yeah, it's very simple, this one here. A slightly more complex fragment, and this will be the last one that I show you, takes place also at the reception service between Lydia and two students from Brazil, Isaura and Martina. So at the end of the interaction, Lydia gives the students a copy of Catalan-Portuguese phrasebook, before saying goodbye and wishing them luck at the university. So as she hands over the phrasebook, Isaura makes a joke. She says, Això què és? In theory, these students don't speak any Catalan, but they decide to make a joke over what they do know in Catalan, Això què és? Yeah, you'll hear it now. And basically what Lydia does is take up that joke and she turns it into a situation for teaching and learning. Yeah, so she's very hábil. She's very good at turning everyday situations into situations for teaching and learning. So I've divided the fragment here into two sections so that you can read it, yeah? So the first part.
Bueno, mira, en el diccionario portugués catalán. Muy bien. Y así fue. Entonces aquí... Això què és? Això què és? Així. Molt bé, però d'on has aprendido? No, és que no sé. No sé.
Yeah, sorry, the second part.
Això, esto què és? Això què és? Esto què és?
Ah, sí?
Així. Mira, era una broma. Ah, pues no, la producción también, que digo, mira. Y luego mira, de catalán.
Yep. So, summarizing the results of the study just presented, we can say that opportunities for learning diverse languages emerge across the entire corpus of the interactions studied, although it's true that they're less common in formal interactions. These opportunities most often result as the result of a language problem that needs repair. However, they also emerge when there's no apparent trouble. And this leads us to argue that in international encounters, people are keen not only to understand and to be understood, but also to take active steps to learn. And we would argue that this needs to be taken advantage of. So, I guess some of you, and myself as well, some of you might be thinking that it's all very good to present 30-second fragments of interaction. No, it's very interesting, but so what? No, so what? And this is where we might find inspiration from more action research-oriented projects. For example, a project that was carried out in Sweden at a place called the Interactive Institute and was led by Brendan Clark, and they had participants such as Johannes Wagner, who's a big name in second language acquisition studies from an interactionist perspective. So the project was called Språkskap, and it ended in 2011. There are continuation projects now. I would recommend the two publications that have been referenced here. The interesting thing about this project is the researchers like us not only recognized opportunities in the wild for teaching and learning languages at a university in Sweden, But they also took active steps to implement material and conceptual structures that would optimize opportunities for informal learning, for informal language learning. Yeah, and this is probably what we have pending. So, to give you an idea of what they did on this project, basically they conceptualized learners in a more active way. They conceptualized language speakers, who may or may not be native speakers of the target language, as language coaches. Yeah, so everybody could be a language teacher. They saw the role of teachers, researchers and schools as setting up support, structural material and conceptual support to scaffold language learning outside of the classroom. Yeah, so they weren't doing away with language schools, they weren't doing away with teachers, but they were transforming the role of language teachers, researchers and schools as places where learners received concrete scaffolds that they could take away with them into the wild to learn language. And they also worked with the public and private services to turn these services into stages for language learning. Okay, just to give you an idea of what they did. Excuse my artwork here. Basically, the solid red dots would be face-to-face interventions. Yeah, so this is where they brought learners, volunteers, the public, the private services, the researchers, designers together to come up with, to brainstorm together and to create together conceptual and physical scaffolds that the learners and the coaches and the services could take away with them. Yeah, and then the empty circles would be the wild. Yeah. So the learners went out, used the scaffolds, and then came back. Yeah. To give you an idea of the scaffolds that they came up with, we have the svenska dags. Yeah. So the context they were working in is basically one where the students, international students, would come to the university and they would use English all of the time. Yeah. So they tried to encourage them to learn Swedish outside of the class. So the svenska dags temstaswork. Time for Swedish. Basically, this is nothing revolutionary here. They had a card, it was laminated, the volunteers, the language coaches, all the students, all the service providers would have this card. They could pull it out at any time, yeah, and they could write a number of minutes on it. Yeah, so 10 minutes, we're going to speak in Swedish, yeah. And on the back they had certain recommendations for the coaches and for the learners, yeah? So for example, give and take extra time, be patient, or focus on communication rather than grammar or vocab, And if there are misunderstandings, repeat what you've said, but not more than twice, yeah? So this is one idea. They also had challenges, yeah? So when the students would come to the volunteers, the designers, the coaches, the teachers would come to these face-to-face sessions, they would set challenges. Yeah. So one of the challenges here is speak Swedish with a person that you always speak English to for an hour, and then there are some tips as to how to do that. Yeah. So they would set these challenges, and then the students would go out, accomplish the challenges, and they would either come back to the face-to-face sessions to talk about how they went, or they would share their experience through mobile technologies, which I'll show you in a minute, yeah? What else did they do? They worked with a cafeteria that was near the school, the Fika Fika. Yeah, this is not a photo of the Fika Fika. The Fika Fika is not online. Okay, the Fika Fika was a cafeteria where a lot of the students went, yeah? A lot of the students, the international students went. So basically, they worked with this cafeteria, with the staff at the cafeteria, to train them in how to serve a learner of Swedish. Yeah, they also set up the cafeteria in such a way that there was a lot of stimulus for talking. Yeah, so the designers created a visual display, photos that would get the students talking, maybe some vocabulary that was useful to get the students talking. Yeah, and then they also in the face-to-face sessions, they also worked with the students that had never been to the Fika Fika about how an interaction at Fika Fika took place. Yeah, so they practiced and then they went to Fika Fika and they were on their own in the wild. Yeah, and then the 1,000 Meter Club is something that the project team dreamed about but never put in place. Yeah, we can assume that they were in an urban setting in Stockholm. Yeah, where there was plenty of business around. Probably not the case here, no. But we could make it the 100, I don't know, the 20-kilometer club. I don't know. So they say, what if within a 1,000-meter radius of the language school, a cafe had a certain spot near the counter where learners could observe the interactions of other customers to prepare their own interaction. Yeah. So rather than going into a cafeteria and having to know what to do straight away, maybe you could stand at the side, watch what other people do well, and then try it out yourself. Yes, without that being weird. Yeah. So they would have to work with the business to make that not be weird. Or what if a bicycle repair shop had pictures with words of bicycle parts and common phrases, yeah, aimed at language learners. Or what if a restaurant had a happy hour where learners could just go and talk to the staff. Yeah, so these are ideas that they had. They're working with Swedish, but it makes me think that in Barcelona we've got, I mean, there are plenty of businesses, you know, where languages, apart from Spanish and Catalan, are being used. You know? So the idea here might be working with those companies to set up agreements whereby our language learners could go and practice their language without that being a strange thing for them to do. Yeah. In terms of the conceptual tools, they worked with the students on something they call sit, talk, sit. So basically, before going into an encounter, and in their case, they sent the students to IKEA. Before going into an encounter, they would have the students sit down, take notes, prepare themselves for the encounter. Yeah, they would sometimes do that with a language coach, with a volunteer, a friend, somebody that knew how to prepare learners for these sorts of encounters. They would go off, and then they would come back and sit again. Yeah, and comment on how they went, reflect on the vocabulary or the expressions that they needed or whatever. And they used a passport to do that. And finally, they worked with the learners and their coaches on what they call the encounter dial. So working with them as to how to repair. Yeah, so in the data I showed you, we had a lot of examples of repair. Yeah, and it seemed to go well, but we can also assume that sometimes these repairs don't go well, no? They mean that the conversation deviates too much from its main point, no? Which might be to register as a student or to get your bike fixed, yeah? So the dial included 3 stages. Easy out would be to abandon the conversation altogether when you have a problem. Full press would be to deviate completely from the main point of the interaction. And step in and step out is kind of what we saw the people in my videos, in my audio, doing, yeah? Momentarily attending to language and then getting back to the main purpose of what they were doing. Yeah. And as I mentioned, all of this was collected, yeah, through mobile and web-based resources as well. So they set up a mobile application that unfortunately is no longer available, where the students could go out into the wild in places that had not necessarily been set up by the team, no, not necessarily services set up by the team. They could go out, record their interactions, and geotag them to maps. Yeah, so learners that needed to go to the hairdresser, for example, could search the map and find a hairdressing encounter that a previous learner had engaged in, listen to it, prepare for it, no? See what that type of encounter was going to be like, see what type of problems a learner could have, yeah? And then they could go and get their hair cut as well with a little bit more preparation, yeah? Yeah, so the idea was giving them tools so that they could prepare for interactions before they took place. Yeah, they could also suggest challenges. Yeah, so they could suggest the challenges in the face-to-face sessions, but they could also suggest them through the mobile application. And they could comment on how they went in carrying out the challenges. They could share recordings of their challenges, photos from the challenges. Yeah, and what else could they do? All these things you've got here. Yeah, they could take their notes when they did this sit, talk, sit. They could take their notes. They also had the the encounter dial there on the application so they could consult it at any time to see what they should be doing when they have a problem. Yeah. If you're interested in seeing what this team does, I really recommend their site. Yeah, the Interactive Institute, it's TII.se. Yeah, the project that I've just explained has ended, but they have other ones such as Dare to Talk or another one about participating in language that are continuing and that are taking up the work that was initiated in Scrap. Yep. So, concluding, I'd like to highlight that the data from the Dylan project suggests evidence that language learning is taking place at international universities in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of places that we probably hadn't thought too much about. But my main argument is that apart from recognizing this possibility, there's an enormous opportunity for us to implement strategies to optimize the wild for language learners by creatively providing temporary scaffolding that involves diverse members of the university community and beyond. And we really need to keep exploring the possibilities of mobile learning for this, geotagging, augmented reality, all of these things that we have available to us right now. And I feel that this would be an exciting and novel way of attending to the linguistic needs of international universities and of linking formal situations of language learning to the real world even more. Y ya está. Moltes gràcies i bon curs.
Gràcies a tu, Emilee. Obrim ara un torn per preguntes, comentaris sobre la conferència.
I tu que coneixes molt bé l'autònoma des de fa, com ens deies fa una estona, 10 anys o més, comptants anys d'estudi, podries atrevir-te a fer alguna recomanació específica pel que fa a aquests espais d'interactuació internacional, com podríem millorar per atendre aquestes necessitats de seguir aprenent el català i no el castellà fora de l'aula pels estudiants internacionals?
A veure, al Servei de Llengües aquí feu molt bona feina, no? A través dels voluntaris i tots aquests projectes que teniu. Sé que també feu molta cosa d'aprenentatge mòbil, no? Esteu iniciant projectes que són interessants. Però potser aquí també falta una formació del personal, no? Que treballa a les universitats, que està atenent en el dia a dia als estudiants, per exemple, no? En la Lídia, que hem presentat aquí, no puc dir en quina universitat treballa, però la Lídia és un molt bon exemple d'un coach lingüístic, no? Sense haver rebut cap formació. Sí que vam treballar amb aquestes dades, amb el seu servei, per mostrar, no? Que ella feia coses molt bones, que potser havien d'aprendre d'ella, els seus companys, però jo crec que faria falta aquesta formació, no? Com atendre els estudiants internacionals, tant pels voluntaris lingüístics, no? Que ajuden a l'ensenyament del català, com pel personal que ajuden a l'ensenyament, en els serveis generals, no? Que poden ser oportunitats per l'aprenentatge i l'ensenyament. No sé. Sí.
De totes maneres, sí que és veritat que un curs de formació a les persones que tenen directament, als estudiants quan arriben, per exemple a l'International Welcome Point, doncs és útil i jo penso que se n'han fet, però jo crec que aquí també és important que el docent que rep a l'estudiant durant els 4 mesos, perquè clar, el personal d'administració i serveis interactua amb l'estudiant en ocasions molt concretes, per necessitats concretes de l'estudiant. Realment és el docent que el té a l'aula i els mateixos estudiants, els mateixos companys, els que poden ajudar més en aquest context d'aprenentatge i ensenyament. Llavors, des del punt de vista del personal d'administració i serveis veig factible, des del punt de vista ja de tot l'altre col·lectiu veig una mica més difícil, però n'hem de parlar.
Jo diria que hi ha una cosa, i és, parlo pel càrrec que estic ocupant ara, el barret d'això, però també el barret de professor, soc professor a la Facultat d'Educació de Llengua. I realment en aquest coaching el que és interessant i el que és difícil és que el professor espontani, no sé com en dieu vosaltres, aquest professor espontani que apareix, tingui algunes nocions clares, no moltes, però clares, de com funciona una llengua. I penso, potser hauríem d'inventar-nos una mena de quines són les nocions bàsiques que ha de fer una persona quan es troba en aquesta situació per no incórrer en més errors dels que hauria de fer. Entenc, perquè de la mateixa manera que pot ajudar també pot perjudicar, per exemple, pot caure en prejudicis d'aquesta mena. Això és interessant, no se m'acut com es podria fer, però sí que estaria bé que podria formar part del projecte que estem tirant a terme d'Internationalization at Home. Una part de l'Internationalization at Home seria adquireix uns mínims de què és una llengua perquè quan et trobis en la situació d'aprenent o en la situació d'ensenyant, puguis ajudar en aquest sentit. No se m'havia acudit que l'Internationalization at Home pogués tenir aquest aspecte, però sí que seria interessant que el fes, perquè de la mateixa manera que tu registres casos positius com aquests aquí, també deus registrar casos negatius de gent que diu coses sobre la llengua que són totalment errònies i que, no sé si en el corpus en tens registrat, però gent que repeteix clixés, coses sabudes, per exemple, entre el català i el castellà, els falsos amics, no sé, però penso que seria interessant.
Sí, en tot cas, els ensenyaments que veiem són els necessaris en el moment, no? Potser el Roger, des del punt de vista de la norma, no és el millor model, però sí que en aquest moment d'una conversa entre amics és capaç d'ajudar el Simon amb el llenguatge que necessita i que és adequat per a aquest context.
Jo, Emilee, també et volia fer una pregunta, que és, a veure, les universitats catalanes totes tenen una política lingüística basada en un marc bastant com simplificador, una llengua pròpia, 2 llengües oficials, 3 llengües de treball, i aquesta política és clar que ha tingut efectes en les pràctiques lingüístiques de la universitat, però alhora també és clar, i crec que amb els teus exemples s'ha mostrat que aquestes pràctiques desborden de molt aquesta política lingüística, però en canvi, així com la política ha tingut uns efectes limitats i potser més limitats del que alguns esperaven fa un temps sobre les pràctiques, a la inversa veig que tota aquesta complexitat lingüística i riquesa lingüística no hi ha un retorn cap a la política, i em pregunto si això pot ser atribuïble al fet que no sé si els parlants són conscients quan estan en aquestes situacions d'aprenentatge, que això és una situació d'aprenentatge o és una cosa de la qual no en tenen consciència o que no valoren i per tant això impedeix o dificulta que tingui un retorn cap al model lingüístic de la universitat o d'alguna altra institució. No sé si m'explico.
Sí, no sé. A veure, no som experts nosaltres en anàlisi de les polítiques, o sigui, no puc prendre una postura clara aquí. Jo entenc que les polítiques i les pràctiques són coses molt diferents. Les pràctiques tenen un objectiu concret, que és resoldre un problema, aconseguir un servei, i les polítiques tenen un altre objectiu totalment diferent, que és evitar conflictes entre llengües, assegurar el lloc de cada llengua. Jo crec que és molt difícil. O sigui, nosaltres vam estudiar les pràctiques i a partir d'aquí intentar veure si les polítiques reflectien el que passava en les pràctiques. I la veritat és que normalment no és així. I podríem dir que les polítiques estan mal fetes, però jo crec que és impossible que una política expliqui totes les pràctiques que podrien tenir lloc en una universitat. O sigui, les necessitats que tenen les persones en el dia a dia són molt més diverses que les situacions que contemplen les polítiques. O sigui, jo, no sé, els veig com dues coses diferents que no forçosament han de ser iguals. No sé.
Hi ha algun altre comentari, pregunta? No? Doncs, si no hi ha res més, agraïm de nou a Emilee la teva intervenció i passo la paraula al vicerector Lluís Quintana, que farà la cloenda de l'acte.
Toca l'acte de parla de dir de la cloenda de la... Sí, volia fer un parell d'observacions. Bueno, primer, que sempre sortim una mica desanimats quan sentim aquests col·legues nostres que no són d'origen català no parlant sentir el català, perquè sabem que, vaja, almenys jo sé que el meu anglès no serà mai com el català de l'Emi, i això em desanima una mica, però en fi, ho superaré. L'altra cosa és aquesta alarmant notícia que tothom pot ser professor de llengua i em pensava que només érem els que teníem el carnet. I això vol dir que els que tenim el carnet hem d'aprendre que hem d'ensenyar alguna altra cosa que no sigui ensenyar llengua, sinó que potser hem d'ensenyar a ensenyar llengua, és d'ensenyar a reflexionar sobre com ensenyar llengua, una cosa d'aquestes. Cosa que és una mala notícia perquè jo ja tenia els apunts esgrogueïts i amb aquests ja em servia. La tercera cosa és que aquests dies hi ha un fòrum a Barcelona, que és el Forum of Study Abroad, que són les universitats i les agències americanes que envien estudiants a Europa. I aleshores fan una trobada anual als Estats Units i una trobada anual a Europa. I aquests dies s'està fent a Europa a la Pompeu Fabra. I un dels temes era, concretament el tema en el qual jo vaig haver de participar, era quin impacte tenien aquests estudiants que venien en la pràctica quotidiana de les universitats locals. I una de les reflexions era que havíem de començar a canviar l'actitud. Per exemple, l'actitud de les universitats catalanes fins ara era amaguem això al català perquè si se n'enteren no vindran. I l'altra era, sobretot, quan parlem en castellà fem veure que tenim un accent de Valladolid perquè l'accent nostre és horrorós i això els desanimarà. I amb això ho estem canviant bastant, jo crec, i estem tots dient dues coses. El primer missatge és existeix el català i el català conviu amb el castellà i això és bo. Això és bo, és a dir, hi ha moltes llengües, això és bo, i això és Europa. Europa consisteix en que hi ha moltes llengües alhora, i és una cosa que els americans els posa una mica nerviosos. Quan dic americans vull dir USA, perquè els posa nerviosos, perquè venen d'entorns molt monolingües, i entrar en un entorn multilingüe crea una certa tensió, i tenim experiències d'alumnes que es queixen perquè els han dit que la classe serà en anglès, aleshores un alumne que fa una pregunta en català, el professor no se'n recorda que allò era en anglès i contesta en català i això els neguiteja. Aleshores han d'aprendre a superar aquest neguit, perquè el món fora dels Estats Units és això. I aquesta és una cosa important. I l'altra cosa important és que el shifting del català al castellà és positiu perquè mostra com la pluralitat no va en detriment del coneixement de la pròpia llengua i de la professionalitat en la pròpia llengua. Jo crec que això és interessant. I, per tant, la vinguda d'aquests estudiants estrangers ens heu obligat a reflexionar sobre la nostra pròpia llengua. I en aquest sentit, la reflexió de l'estudi de l'Emilee jo crec que és molt important perquè ens fa reflexionar sobre reflexos que fèiem espontanis i com això potser és espontani però amaga una certa percepció del que és la llengua. Jo crec que en aquest sentit tots ens estem obligant a canviar la visió que tenim de la nostra pròpia llengua i de les llengües estrangeres. Bé, un cop més felicito el Servei de Llengües per la iniciativa que ha tingut, el felicito també perquè ha convertit almenys per mi, aquesta jornada una mica formal d'iniciar el curs amb una reflexió interessant i us agraeixo a tots vosaltres que hagueu vingut i us hagueu interessat. Moltes gràcies.